So this week we are going to be focusing on receptors. And those receptors are located at that postsynaptic membrane. So what we've recently done is we talked about that synaptic vesicle release based on calcium signaling. And now we've got neurotransmitters at the synapse. Now those need to bind to receptors at that postsynaptic membrane. So we're going to look at some specific ones, and we've seen them a little bit before when we talked about ion channels, because some receptors are ion channels. Some of the ones that we talked about in that big ion channel chapter were like voltage-gated ion channels, right? So those are happening for the action potential, and the voltage-gated calcium channels that are important for the neurotransmitter release. But now we're talking about the ones that are being targeted and bound to neurotransmitters. So the voltage-gated channels are opened and closed based on changes in voltage. The ligand-gated ion channels are the ones that are binding to, or neurotransmitters are binding to those receptors and opening and closing the ion channel. But in addition to the ligand-gated channels, we also have G protein coupled receptors, which themselves are not ion channels, but they change something that happens inside the cell. So we're going to talk about both of those types of receptors when we zoom in on that postsynaptic membrane here. And if you remember at the very beginning, we kind of started right here where we recognized that the excitatory postsynaptic potentials or inhibitory postsynaptic potentials could add up and do the electrotonic spread to reach the axon hillock. So this is now what we're talking about. We've kind of come full circle, where now after the changes in the receptor activation here, you might get a change in membrane potential that would then lead to the action potential. So we're at the end of this section with what we've talked about for the electrical stuff. I know we're all not even halfway. Are we halfway through? I know we're a portion of the way through, and we've come full circle already. But there's actually other stuff that can happen here that is not related directly to neural communication or neural transmission of action potentials, because there's other neural communication that can happen and change the genetic regulation of things, which is basically what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the semester. But for now, we're talking about how the neurotransmitter is activating specific receptors. And the first part of this is just a quick review. When we're talking about the two different types of receptors that are located at that postsynaptic membrane, you've got the ionotropic or receptors or ligand-gated channels, or also called ligand-gated receptors. And then also the metabotropic receptors or G protein coupled receptors. So we have already talked about this before in NEU200, and maybe if you were in an early bio class, you've talked about the difference between these types of receptors. So what I just want you to do, real quick, put these where they go. How many subunits? How fast is the response? How long does the change occur? What they're associated with, and then whether they're integral membrane proteins or peripheral membrane proteins, the receptors themselves. So pause and put these where you think they go. So for the number of subunits, the ionotropic receptors have multiple subunits. If you want to, actually, before I start this, if you had trouble with any of these, I do have an image on the next one that has the ligand-gated ion channels and then the G protein coupled receptors here. So if you want to kind of pause, and then also here, so ligand-gated channels, G protein coupled receptor. So if you want to pause and then kind of work through it with a picture if you need that extra help. But the first one, the ligand-gated channel has multiple subunits. The G protein coupled receptor only has one subunit. And what we're going to be doing, we kind of looked at these a little bit. We're going to be going in more detail for some of these for specific receptor types. So the metabotropic receptors are one subunit, ionotropic are multiple. The ionotropic receptors are just opening an ion channel, so that's going to be a fast response. Metabotropic receptors is this activates this, which activates this, which activates this, which is a slower response. But that slower response leads to more long-term changes because even after the neurotransmitter leaves the receptor, the intracellular changes hang around longer, as opposed to the ionotropic receptors, which are just opening the channel and then closing the channel, and then now we've got no more ions moving through. And then hopefully this one was kind of easy. The ionotropic receptors have a pore, and the metabotropic receptors have the G protein. This one was a little bit of a trick because both of them are the same. The associated G protein is a peripheral membrane protein, but the receptors themselves, because they span the membrane, they are both integral membrane proteins. And then if you wanted to know, this associated G protein is a peripheral membrane protein. So we've got the basics of those. This is a little bit more of a review, but I want to make sure everybody understands the big picture and the difference between these before we move on and talk about the specific ionotropic receptors first. And at the end, we'll talk about the specific metabotropic receptors.